You don't know him, but on the day Jason Norris was baptized, everybody who knew him knew it was a big milestone in his life. That Sunday morning, he had come early to the service. His smile was from ear to ear, and he was glowing. He was tall, and so he was already an impressive figure. He was redheaded, so that made him impressive as well, but it was the fire in his eyes that you could see on that morning. And he was clearly taking a new step in his life. He and I had been working towards that for a little bit of time, and in fact, it all started about 2 years before that moment. I got an email from a guy named Jason who said, "I think I need your church." And I wrote him back and I said, "I think you do." And so we started an email conversation that lasted all of 2 emails back and forth. And in the second one, I said, "Okay, let's meet." And we got together at the Arby's that was right across the street from where this church was. And I met him, and we sat down, we started talking, and he began to tell me his story. And lo and behold, the time he was baptized wasn't the first milestone in his life. There had been a number of previous milestones that led up to that point. And so we were meeting in Arby's, and he was telling me about a couple of the milestones that had happened in his life before then. He had been dating this girl for like 6 years, and he thought he was in love, and she thought she was in love, and they thought they were going to be together for forever, and they just hadn't tied the knot yet. And he didn't really care too much about God. He wasn't raised in a Christian home or anything like that. And then she dumped him out of the blue. And he was bitter. And his heart was torn open and bleeding, and he was in that dark place. That dark place with life and that dark place with God where you say, am I good enough? Am I doing the right thing? Have I really screwed up my life? Did I just waste the last 6 years? And he was in that dark place. And a friend of his had recently started going to church, and she went to a really small church that was desperate for Sunday school teachers at the time. And even though this girl had not made any commitment of faith or anything like that, and was just beginning to learn the Bible herself, that church asked her to teach Sunday school, and she was like, okay. So she was preparing to teach Sunday school for this class of young kids, and was working through the Bible and said to Jason, "Can you help me?" And Jason says, "I don't know anything." And she says, "Okay, then we're together. We're on the same page." So I don't know anything either. So he's never been to church before. He's never opened his Bible before. And he starts meeting with this girl to prepare lessons in the Bible for this Sunday school class. Milestone. In his time there, he was inspired, maybe I should read this book for myself. And he began to read it. And so sitting across the table from me in Arby's, he tells me his story. I was reading in the Gospel of Luke, and I came to that passage. I now know it's in Luke 6. He says, I came to that passage where Jesus says, if you don't forgive your brother when he sins against you, your Father in heaven won't forgive you. And he said, I was convicted. In my heart, I just realized that I had not forgiven this girl for dumping me. My heart was filled with bitterness and anger and darkness, and I hadn't forgiven her. And in that moment, I just knelt down on the ground and my hands clenched, and I said, God, I don't know how to forgive her. I don't. But I know that if I'm going to forgive her, then it's part of the fact that you're going to forgive me, and I need your forgiveness. And so what I'm going to do, God, is I'm just going to open up my hand and release this to you. And so I can't forgive her, but if you forgive me, then maybe you can forgive her through me. And he's on his knees and he's crying and he's opening his hands to God and he says, God, would you please forgive me? And Jesus tells a story about a tax collector who's in this temple and he's beating his chest and kneeling before God and says, God, I'm a sinner. Would you forgive me? And Jesus says, that man is forgiven. So now I'm staring at a real life experience of this. He was in his living room, not in his church or anything else, but he had been reading the Bible. And I'm a pastor, I've been in church my whole life. I was raised in the thing. And here he is sitting across from me telling me a story of reading the Bible, encountering God, and handing his life over to him. And my mouth is hanging wide open. I've never heard this before. Most of the people that I've met who've come to know Jesus have done so because one person told them the story. And here's a guy who's on his own reading the Bible, and God meets him. That's a milestone. That's the milestone. I looked at him square, and usually in a conversation like that, my next line is, Well, tell me, has there ever been a time in your life when you prayed to receive Jesus as your Savior? Has there ever been a time in your life where you gave your life over to God? And I couldn't ask that next question because he just told me he had. And I was like, dude, you're the first person I've ever met who's come to that place simply from reading the Bible. God is doing something big in your life. A couple years later, we're sitting together preparing for his baptism, and I said, you know, you've never prayed the standard prayer before, but I know your heart, I know your story. Tell me this, would you count that as your starting moment with God? Or do you want to have your starting moment with God right now, and we can pray the technical, whatever it's called, sinner's prayer with each other? Or some people just use baptism as that moment. He says, I want that. So when he came that Sunday morning, he was remembering 2 years ago when he had begged God for forgiveness and knew God had given it to him. And now he was standing in front of a congregation full of people to say, I am clean and I am new. And so the milestone that I experienced and the whole congregation experienced just was one of them. There was a previous milestone in Arby's, and before that there was another milestone in his living room. And all of us have milestones like that, times when we've been in our dark place and God came through. Times when we've been at the top of the mountain and God revealed it was because of his work in our lives. We've all been in different kinds of milestone experiences, and this month I want to ask you to share with me yours. Whether it's on the backside of the Connect card, on our church website, my Facebook, I don't really care. We're just going to go on a journey together of sharing milestone stories. And we all know them when we see them in the lives of other people. When I see a milestone in my kids' lives, I totally know it. Well, I didn't. I used to not know it. But, you know, when I first became a dad, my wife, Jennifer, and her mom and dad had come out and visited us. And they apparently knew all these milestones that I didn't know. Like, it's apparently a milestone that the baby can sit up by themselves. It's apparently a milestone that the baby can roll over. And I was thinking, well, okay, yay. So it's a milestone when the baby smiles. It's a milestone when the baby lifts his head up. It's a milestone when the baby crawls. When it walks, I knew that one. So I remember this one time I was out, I was doing some work, and my in-laws were in the house. Jen was still in the house, still on maternity leave. And I was coming back from wherever I was doing whatever it was I was doing, like preparing something for a worship band I was leading at the time. And I come back, and everybody's all excited, and they're telling me, Charlie rolled over. And I'm thinking, okay. And they're like, no, that's a milestone. That's a major milestone. So I'm learning this thing. And so then later on that day, he began to be mobile and was rolling all around the house. And then I knew, yes, something different had happened. So I remember the day Charlie rolled over. I remember the day he took his first steps. I remember the day my daughter spent the night without diapers. I remember, don't tell her I said that. I remember these milestones, first day of kindergarten, things like that. It's easy for me to see milestones in other people's lives. I also have some milestones in my own life. I remember the day I decided to propose to my wife. Of course, I remember the day I proposed, but I remember the day I decided to. I remember the conversation I had with my dad to learn how to budget so that I could earn enough money so that I could buy the ring so that I could propose to this woman. I remember those conversations. I remember the first day I was a pastor. I remember the first day this church started. I have milestones in my memory. And some of them are dark places too. Some of them are the high mountain peaks, and some of them are the dark, low valleys. But where God meets you is a milestone in your life. And so what we're doing this month is we're going to go on a journey together. We're going to share our milestones, we're going to celebrate milestones, and we're going to do it in the context of some major milestones in the Bible. I'm going to take you to some stories that maybe you're not totally familiar with, but they're those milestones that precede the other milestones. So jump with me into the Bible, Hebrews chapter 11. It's printed on your note sheet. It'll be on the screen. We're talking about Abraham. And here's an obvious milestone in his life. People know about the guy named Abraham. Many people do. He's the most famous guy in the Old Testament. Here we go. Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice, Isaac his son, as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." That's a milestone. Because see, God had said to Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your only son, Isaac, to me. And Abraham got to the place where he has the knife up in the air and he's ready to come down on his son and kill his own son. And God says, no, that's just a test. Hang on. I provided a substitute over here. So you get the substitute, the ram that was caught in a thicket over here. You bring that ram, you sacrifice that ram, and you know that I'm the God who provides substitutes. I'm the God who steps into the place, who provides so that you can keep your commitment to me. You don't have to do it on your own. I'm the God who provides for that. Abraham learned a lesson there. That was a major milestone in his life, but that wasn't the first one. His first milestone was back in Genesis 12. And in Genesis 12, God speaks to him. He says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your name great. You're going to be a blessing to everybody. In Genesis chapter 13, there's another milestone. God's voice comes to Abraham somehow, and he says to him, I'm going to give you all this land that you can see. So in Genesis 12, God says, I'm going to bless you. All I want you to do is get up from here and go to this other place where I take you. And then in that other place, I'm going to give you all this land. Then in Genesis 13, he says, look at the land that you're now in. I'm going to give it all to you. Then in Genesis 15, God comes up to him another time and he says, personally, now I'm going to give you a son. I'm going to give you a son from your own body. Then in Genesis 17, God says, I'm going to give you a son through your wife who is like 80 years old, barren, and just absolutely destitute from the reproductive standpoint. I'm going to give you a son through her, even though Abraham himself was 99 at the point in time. And so that's in 17. And then this thing where God says, would you sacrifice your son? That comes in Genesis 22. So let's go back to 15. Because in 15, I think the most profound milestone experience happens for Abraham. It's not the first one. It's not the biggest one. It's not the most elaborate one. But it's profound for at least two reasons. Genesis 15. If you're using the Bibles we passed out, it's on page 9. It's on page 9. And we're just going to start at the beginning and read. So let's go. Genesis 15. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. And by the way, this is his original name. Abram was his original name. God changed it to Abraham in chapter 17. Do not be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, wait a minute. But Abram said, this is the first time he talks back to God. Up until this point in time, in 12 and in 13, God just simply shows up with a promise, but there's no interaction. Now we're told something's different. What's different is, number one, it's a vision, verse 1, which means Abraham is now encountering God in some type of way where there's a to and fro, a back and forth. And so now he's responding to God. It says, but Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Now, to understand what's happening here, God says to Abraham, and I'm just going to call him Abraham because that's easy. God says to Abraham, I'm going to be your reward. And Abraham says, wait a minute. If you're my reward, what can you give me? What is the reward? What can you give me? Because see, in that time, if you die and you don't have an heir, then the stuff you have gets disseminated. It gets dispersed. It gets spread out. So whatever God gives him isn't really giving to Abraham because Abraham doesn't have anything after he's dead. And at this point in time, he's already in his 80s. So God says, I'm going to be your reward. And Abraham says, wait a minute, how are you going to do this? What are you going to give me? Now, there's a really important principle here I want you to think about. He doesn't doubt that God will do it. He doubts how God will do it. And there's a difference. See, here's Abraham. And in chapter 12, God made this promise. In chapter 13, God made this promise. That was back when he was in his 70s. Now he's in his mid to late 80s. And God hasn't done any of this stuff yet. He's still wandering. He doesn't have any children. And so now he's in that dark place of saying, is God really going to do this? But he doesn't ask the question, is God going to do it? He asks the question, how God is going to do it. You and I get in that dark place all the time where we think God has made a promise to us. He says things in the Bible like, I have predestined you to be conformed to the image of my son, Jesus. You are on a journey to become more like Jesus. Or he'll say other things like, everything works together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Or he'll say other things like, I watch over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Or I have never seen the righteous go hungry. God makes all kinds of promises, and yet we get into those dark places, those times when things aren't working exactly the way we thought they would work, and we begin to question, is God going to keep his promise? Abraham doesn't. He says, I believe God's going to keep his promise. What I want to know is how. God, I know you're going to give me something because you said you were going to give me something, but what is it? Because I'm about to die, and my inheritance is going to go to this slave, Eliezer, who's not even from my hometown or from this area. He's from Damascus. Verse 4, then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. This is very profound. Because see, that's not the way gods are supposed to work. Everybody who's ever heard any religious teaching knows this. I mean, gods work like this. This is the way gods are supposed to work. Gods are supreme, and they tell you what they want you to do. And then you do what they want you to do, or you're in trouble. That's the way gods are supposed to work. Gods tell you what they want you to do, and then if you do what they want you to do, you get whatever it is they want to give you. If you don't do what they want you to do, then you're in trouble. That's the way gods are supposed to work. Abram is having a very confusing experience because the first thing God ever said to him was, I'm going to bless you. The second thing God ever said to him was, I'm going to give you all this land. The third thing God ever said to him was, I'm your reward, and I'm going to give you a son. See, God doesn't work like all the other gods. The real and true God says, no. We start this relationship with me giving. And what does he want in return? Well, we're told there. What does Abram do in response? Verse 6, Abram believed the Lord, and God credited it to him as righteousness. That's enough. Here's the blanks you should write down. God wants our faith, and he gives us his grace. God gives us grace. That means we didn't earn it. Abram didn't do anything to get this promise. In fact, he asked a doubting question, and God replied to Abram's doubting question with, okay, I'm going to give you a son. And then Abram simply says, all right, if you say it, I'm going to believe it. And see, we think of the word faith in the wrong directions too. We think that faith is one of these super religious terms. I have faith that God is going to move this mountain in my life. That's not what Abram's doing here. See, what he's doing is God says, I'm going to give you a son. And Abraham says, okay, that's faith. That's belief. That's him saying, all right. Just believing that God is actually going to do it. Not believing how he's going to do it, just believing that he's going to do it. And that's enough for God. God sees that, and the verse says, credits it to him as righteousness. How many of you have ever done anything wrong in your life? Okay? Everybody, right. Those of you who didn't raise your hands, shame on you. You should raise them now because you just lied. So, we've all done something wrong. The word righteousness is exactly the opposite. The word righteous means you've never done anything wrong. The word righteous means you've always done the right thing. You've always made the right choice. You've always thought the right thought. You've always said the right thing. Righteousness means always the right thing, always doing the right thing, always being the right person. Abram does one thing where he says to God, all right, and God says, that's good enough. I'm going to label you righteous. Totally and completely. This is astounding. Genesis 15:6 is such an important verse that you should memorize it, mark it down, highlight it in your Bible, because this verse sets the Old Testament premise That God is a God who works on the basis of grace, and all he wants is your response of faith. That's it. And that thing carries itself all the way through all the pages. So that when Paul writes the book of Galatians, he bases a lot of what he says on Genesis 15:6. God gives us grace and just wants our faith. But there's something weird that happens here. Because see, what happens after this is now Abram asks another question. It's kind of another doubting question. Verse 7, God also said to him, I'm the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. So here's the second promise. The first promise was the son. The second promise is the land. I'm going to give you this land. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? Now that question is a little bit of a doubt. That question is a little bit of a doubt. That's a doubt that God is going to do it. He says, how can I know? What will you do to confirm to me that you're going to give me this land? And God isn't fazed. Check out what God does next. Okay. So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all of these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. So you get the image of this. What he's doing is he takes a cow, and he chops the cow in half right across the middle, okay? And he puts the head of the cow over here and the butt of the cow over here. Then he goes to the next level, and he takes the goat, and he cuts the goat in half, puts the head over here, the butt over here. Then he does the ram, head, rear. And then he does the birds. But it says here, check this out, it says, the birds, however, he did not cut in half. And then we get this weird line. It says, the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. That's telling us that this isn't imaginary. This is real. There are real birds coming out of the sky to eat the dead animals. This isn't just some metaphor. This isn't just some vision. This is really happening. There are real animals cut in half on the ground, separated by this aisle. Okay? Sounds a little weird. Keep going. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there, but I will punish the nation they serve as slaves. And afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. A weird section here. God is about to do something with Abraham, but before he does it, he brings Abraham to a dark place and says, trouble is coming. There's going to be a hard time. But don't worry, I'm going to bring you, your descendants, through that hard time. See, even when God is making promises, he wants us to know that part of his promise includes the dark moments. Includes those times that we have to walk through scary places. When you're going through one of those times, it's not that God has left you alone or that he's given up on you. That's just part of the journey. It's part of the road. Sometimes God had it mapped out long before. Keep going. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Okay, lots of people. But the smoking firepot and blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. We don't really know historically what this is all about. But what we know is that God is doing this symbol thing to make a covenant with Abraham. And we have a hint over what it means by looking at Jeremiah. I've printed it on your note sheet. Jeremiah 34:18 says this, those who violated my covenant and have not fulfilled the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat like the calf they cut in two and then walked between its pieces. God says, if you violate the covenant, I'm going to treat you like the calf that you cut in two and walked between the pieces. Okay, so based on that and based on our knowledge of some ancient history, this is what's happening here. Most likely, the best we can piece this together is that when two people were making a covenant with each other, they wouldn't sign their names on a piece of paper and then file it with the state. They wouldn't go through some ceremony like that. What they would do is they would take an animal and they would cut it in half and they would walk between the pieces. So here you go. You've got a cow's rear over there. You've got a cow's head over here. And you and I are making a decision for each other. And we're going to walk right through it. We're going to walk through it with the idea of this. If you break this covenant, may you become like this cow. If I break this covenant, may I become like this cow. Because see, cows are not supposed to be split. I mean, you split a cow in half, it's not the way they're supposed to work. That means if I'm making a covenant with this other person and we split, that's not the way it's supposed to work. You can think about this in terms of a business arrangement, a marriage, something like that. Maybe for our marriages, we should cut more animals in half and walk. PETA would have a nightmare with that. I mean, it would just... So you walk through this thing and you say to this other person, may you become like that cow if you ever break this. May I become like this cow if I ever break this. Yeah, there'd be less divorce, right? So here you go. You walk through the cow piece. But then there's a ram and a goat and birds. And in this case, it's not just a cow, it's the next level. May I become like the ram. May I become like the goat. May I become like these birds. And that's the image, that you've got this long line of dead things. And if you walk down that aisleway through those dead things, you're saying this covenant is 4 times serious. This covenant is real. This covenant is hard, fast. I mean, this is it. There's no way anyone is going to break this covenant. That's the seriousness of this moment. When I was a kid, we used a phrase, cross my heart and hope to die. Is that still around? Do people still do that? Yeah, I'm old. So, cross my heart and hope to die. You were going to make a promise to someone, and they'd say, I really promise, I'm serious about it. You sure? Yeah, I swear it. Are you positive you're going to do this? Cross my heart. Cross your heart and hope to die. Cross my heart and hope to die. Stick a needle in my eye. That was the last one. And when I was a kid, people were saying that. I was like, what does that all mean? It means you're swearing to your own death. Okay? That's what it's about. It says, may I die if I'm lying to you. I don't think the little kids know that's what they're saying. Okay? It's just a phrase. Say it too fast and it rhymes, and then it's all right. It's cool. But cross my heart and hope to die. That's the thing, okay? If I break it, may I die. Here's the amazing thing. Abram is waking up from his sleep. He's a little groggy, but the sun hasn't yet set. It's still setting. And he opens up his eyes, and what he sees is a bowl and a torch passing through the middle of the pieces. And he's not there. He's watching it happen. If this is a covenant God is making with Abraham, he should be in there too. It should be somehow God and Abraham walking together through that, right? That's the way the covenant is supposed to go. It should be God saying to Abraham, if you break this covenant, I'm going to chop you in half, just like this cow. And it should be Abraham saying to God, God, if you break my covenant, I guess somehow you're going to die? What's that all about? God says, I'm the only one taking responsibility for this covenant here. You just sit over there. I'm going to tell you how serious I am, God says. I'm walking through this. You've got the image of the bowl, the image of the torch, the image of the flame. Somehow the Trinity is represented in there. I'm not exactly sure how that works. Father, Son, Holy Spirit are somehow represented in there. God is walking through the pieces by himself. And he says, I'm making a promise to you, Abraham. If this covenant gets broken by you or by me, I'm the one who's going to die. He walks through the center of those pieces. He says, I promise you, Abraham, I'm going to do this for you. Cross my heart and hope to die. If either one of us breaks this covenant, if I break this covenant, then may I become like this piece. If you break this covenant, may I become like these pieces. God himself says, if you break faith, I'm going to die. See, what God is doing in that moment is he is taking personal responsibility for our lack of faith. Abram shows one tiny little bit of doubt, and God says, I'm taking responsibility for your lack of faith. I am so serious about this promise that I will pay if this covenant gets broken. This is a one-sided, total abandon act of love from God to a human being. We find centuries later that Abraham's descendants failed in that covenant many times. Then you come to sometime around 30 AD when a man named Jesus stands in front of his disciples and says, "This bread is my body broken for you. This cup is my blood, which is the new covenant in my blood given to you." And Jesus says, the new covenant comes when my body is broken in two. That's the image set up for us in Genesis 15. That's the image. That's the milestone in Abraham's life that takes him to chapter 22. So then when God later on says, I want you to sacrifice your son, Abraham says, I have no idea how this is going to go. But I have a God who takes responsibility even for my lack of faith. I want to give you something to take this home with, because I don't know where you are today. Some of you might be feeling like you're in that place of darkness or doubt. God hasn't come through for you like you thought He would, like you wanted Him to. And it's hard for you to believe that He's going to do what He promised He would do, that He would take care of you, that He would love you, that He would shape you into being more like Jesus, that He would turn your circumstances into something for eternal good. It's hard for you to believe that He's going to do that. And I can tell you today, accept that He will, even if you question how He will. Because look at this verse in Hebrews 11, the same chapter that we started with. It says this, without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who earnestly seek Him. The ultimate act of faith is simply this. I believe that God's real and that He blesses those who pursue Him. I believe God is real and He blesses those who pursue Him. God gives grace and just wants my faith. I believe that He's real and I'm going to trust that. He's going to bless when I pursue Him. And some of you are here thinking, I don't even have that kind of faith. Well, you know what? Even if you did have that kind of faith, you can't take credit for it, because look at this next verse. Ephesians 2, 8 and 9, it says, for it's by grace you've been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves. It's the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. God's grace is what saves you through faith, but the faith doesn't come from you. The faith itself is a gift of God. This faith, this is not from yourselves. It's the gift of God. God takes responsibility for your lack of faith. He sent His Son to do something in historical fact. You don't have to have faith, you just have to have a little bit of historical knowledge to know that Jesus died and rose again. That's history. You don't need to have faith about that. God is even giving you faith. He's just handing it to you and says, here you go. If you just simply believe that I'm real and that I really do bless, that's good enough for me. And I will label you righteous and clean and pure. So I don't know where you are today with regard to your faith, with regard to your milestone, with regard to your darkness. But at some point in your past or today, you should claim this milestone as yours. That God, by His grace, promises me eternity, and I, by His faith, receive it. If you've never done it, do it today. Today is your day. Say, God, I'm opening up my hands and asking for your forgiveness. If you've done it in the past, then claim it. Even if you're in a dark place today, claim that God is the one who really is existing and really does bless those who seek Him. Because God gives us grace and just wants our faith. And He even takes responsibility for our lack of faith.